So today we're interviewing Dale Blanton. I'm Bob Rindy, and with me is Jim Knight. Dale, if you want to introduce yourself, please go ahead, and then we'll start by some general questions about when you began working with the LCD, how many years you worked, your assigned duties. So why don't we just start with that general intro? Go ahead.
Sure. I'm Dale Blanton, and I might as well go into my period of time with the agency. I worked a total of 33 years with DLCD. Started in 1978 in November, which ironically I started the end of the month. And at the beginning of the month, there was an election that determined whether or not the state land use program was still going to be in existence. So I was hoping for the best, that I would make a transition from my previous job and become part of the state's planning program. So that's where I began back in 1978, and I worked until actually December of 2011.
Wow. That's probably the record so far.
Well, I think Bob Courtwright has had worked for the agency longer than me, but yeah, I was there a long time and did a number of different jobs. So my beginning was pretty interesting. I remember my interview was at the Portland field office on Stark Street when it was downtown. That was Linda McPherson was the field rep, but my interview team was Eldon Hout, Craig Greenleaf, and Jim Knight. A pretty tough group.
Who was the director at that time?
At that time, it was either Wes Kavarson had just come on, or Hal Bronner was still there, and there was a transition. About the same time that I began working at the agency, Wes came to the agency as the director. So it was around the same time frame.
And remind us, what job were you interviewing for?
I was part of the plan review team. They were hiring 2 urban positions, and at that point they hired Greg Winterroud and myself to take on the more urban goals, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 14 predominantly. So, and I probably shouldn't talk goal numbers, but those were the sort of urban focus that Greg and I had. We were part of a 6-member plan review team that had a variety of specialists. And this was just after the agency had transitioned from its previous form, essentially starting what was called the field division, with Jim Knight as the plan review team supervisor, Eldon Hout as the field division manager. And the notion there was really that the agency needed a more clear field division focus. Prior to that, nearly everybody on the staff was a field representative. They were all responsible for a certain county or a certain jurisdiction or number of jurisdictions. But this was the point in time where I think somebody had actually reviewed the agency structure and recommended that they have sort of a discrete field division as the agency was beginning its transition from goal adoption to now how do we apply these, how do we review comprehensive plans, how do we go through what became known as the acknowledgement or approval process.
And the plans were coming in at that time, I think.
Yeah, the plans were starting to come in, so it's true.
What was your reason for coming on board with the state? As best as you can recall.
Well, coming from local government, I really wanted to contribute the perspective of a local planner, having been in a position of developing a comprehensive plan, trying to look at a jurisdiction's previous planning efforts and the goals and sort of bring them in line. And I had had a lot of contact with the agency field representatives, and I just had longed at that point in time to, like I say, both bring the local perspective to the agency, but also be a part of something new and challenging. I know when I was talking with the field representative for my jurisdiction, oftentimes there weren't
What was your
answers.
jurisdiction?
I was the city planner for the city of Newburgh in Yamhill County. And I think part of my motivation as well, Craig Greenleaf, who'd been the county planning director at Yamhill County, I had a pretty good relationship with him, and he had recently taken the job as the Mid-Valley field representative. So I had some connections and a desire. I also had previously lived in Salem, so the idea of coming to Salem really appealed to me. But mostly it was being a part of something new, something challenging, something exciting, and it turned out to be all of that. It was just a wonderful experience. There were just incredibly talented people at the agency. It's really hard to describe the sort of the culture of the agency at that time frame. People really committed. We had a lot of discussions, very vehement discussions about a variety of issues. Not everyone was on the same page, but it was very collegial. We just had a lot of talent, a lot of brain power to try and help sort of figure out where do we take the statewide planning goals vis-a-vis the local planning effort. So that was all exciting to me.
We'll try to come back to that, Dale. I wanted to make sure that you had a moment to sort of summarize your career with the department, because you went on from there and did several things. Am I right?
Oh, yeah. I did have a number of job responsibilities at the agency, beginning as part of the plan review team. Like I say, sort of a collegial effort. But early on in the agency's review of comprehensive plan, there was a huge amount of workload, and the agency was in a position where it just simply, with the plan review team and field reps, to actually review that amount of planning work. So we began hiring what we called contract reviewers. And at that point, I think Jim was overwhelmed in his plan review team supervisor role, and the agency decided that they needed to sort of expand that and have a second plan review team supervisor to kind of help predominantly with the contract review folks that we were bringing on board, both mentoring those and then also doing the same work in as reviews went forward, reviewing those efforts, editing staff reports, bringing together teams of people to try and review policy issues as they came up. So I applied for the plan review team supervisor job, and it was, again, a fairly arduous interview process with a number of really talented people. I think everyone on the plan review team at that time had applied for the job, and I feel very fortunate. So my second job was really becoming Jim Knight's sort of partner in fostering the plan review team efforts, predominantly, like I say, the efforts at making sure that there was quality control on the plan reviews that went before the commission, and working primarily with the contract review staff. I think at one point we had 13 reviewers in total, six plan review team members, and then 7 contract reviewers. So we had a lot of work going on, and again, the field reps were also heavily involved in that.
So around 85, the plan review effort sort of wound down, and you went on to something else, and I can't remember what that was.
Well, throughout my time at the agency, I kind of had a policy bent. I think Eldon Hout tapped me early on in some of the legislative efforts to help in reviewing and drafting pieces of legislation. I was heavily involved in some of the rule writing, particularly, I think, maybe some of the earliest rule writing efforts. I remember Claire Pucci, who was responsible for Goal 5, the natural resources goal, and I were involved in a fairly politically sensitive writing of the Goal 5 rule, the very first one, sort of at the insistence of the Oregon Forest Industries Council, their lead attorney, Mary Ann Hutton, putting a lot of pressure on the agency over forest issues and sort of the balance between other natural resources and forestry and forest goals. L.B. Day at the time was convening a task force to try and pressure the agency to do some of the Goal 5 rule work. So I was involved in some of that early on. And then the legislature also had told the agency that it needed to convert all of its previous policy papers to rules if it were going to continue to enforce those policies as part of the review process. So I was involved in some of those efforts. And so I gradually had more of a policy bent to things. A lot of efforts around the beginnings of periodic review. There were sort of 3 phases of periodic review. I remember there was initially, we went to the legislature and said, well, look, we're working on acknowledgement, but what then? You know, there is a chance.
What year was that?
Oh, I don't really remember the year. It would have been sort of early to mid 80s. But we realized that these plans, there was a lot of work and effort put into the plans and reviewing them. And then there were really 2 problems with that, and that is, over time, plans were going to become out of date and were going to need to be reviewed. The Land Use Planning Goal 2 called for sort of a review cycle, but there was no process in place at the state agency level to sort of foster that and see what that was going to look like. But we also realized that local governments were over time going to be amending these plans. And there was a chance that either through, I guess the worst case scenario, people thought, well, what happens after these plans are reviewed and approved or acknowledged? What happens if somebody decides to repeal? What do we do about that? And there were concerns about periodically over time amending plans. They could come out of compliance. So there was this notion that there ought to be a look at the state level at amendments to comprehensive plans. So early on, the legislature sort of crafted this more general framework. And if I recall right, Jim, I think you were responsible early on for the first rules aimed at periodic review. And we put in place a set of rules aimed at periodic review. And before they were even employed or put in place, or actually put into practice, I should say, the legislature totally redid the statutes on periodic review. And they put in place really what I call phase 2 of periodic review, which was a set of requirements that local governments go through a findings exercise. We had this idea of a proposed periodic review order, which was a set of findings of how the local government saw its comprehensive plan still meeting the statewide planning goals. So there was this proposed order and final order. Again, like I say, it was a very findings-oriented approach. We did actually begin that effort at the state, implemented those. Of course, we had to rewrite the rules that had been put in place around periodic review. But local governments initially had a pretty negative reaction. I think as did a lot of the interest groups around how much effort was being put into simply writing a set of findings, but not really taking that step back, pulling back, looking at the plan. Really, does it meet the city or county's sort of long-range needs? So I think in the mid-90s, I worked with, at that time, the Deputy Director, Greg Wolf. We convened what we called a periodic review task force. We brought together a number of local planners, a number of interest groups. We sat down in between a legislative session and tried to sort of recraft an effort at periodic review. And at that point, we developed what is pretty consistent with the current approach, which was let's have local governments look at their plans along with citizens and interest groups. Let's have a citizen involvement component of this. But let's have it be a sort of what really needs to be done approach. So sort of phase 3 of periodic review became a work program development effort. And then as local governments finished their periodic review, and again, a look at their plan and how it continues to meet the statewide planning goals, they developed these work programs, and then work tasks would, over a period of years, be undertaken to bring the plan more up to date.
Do the local staffs understand that once a plan was acknowledged, the goals sort of stepped back, and it was their plan, their ordinances and so forth, that actually would implement the goals? Like, you know, for example, Goal 14. I'm anxious to hear about your thoughts about Goal 14 and coming from local government. You know, that was a big step in terms of, you know, working with the county intimately, I believe, in most
Yes.
cases. And whether or not that held up, and did we do enough to give guidance, or did we give too much guidance? And I'm just curious about your thoughts, looking back now. How was it? Was it as I'm describing it, or am I leaving some things out that ought to be talked about?
Well, Goal 14 was, as you know, a very difficult goal in the implementation phase. Early on, there were a number of...
When you say implementation, you don't mean adoption.
No, I mean, I do mean adoption.
Oh, you
I
do?
meant implementation through the acknowledgement process. It's kind of ironic, a couple of plans came through the review process in the early days, City of Eugene and City of Medford, that actually their plans were acknowledged and approved prior to 1978, the big sort of effort to potentially eliminate the planning program. But those were two cities that made it through, but they were approved for the city limits only. They didn't have urban growth boundaries, they weren't reviewed. So, I mean, that was a difficult effort for cities and counties to come together and both jointly agree on an urban growth boundary and sort of a plan for that area between where the cities currently were developed and where they were going to develop over the next 20 years. Bob, you were going to...
Well, I was going to say, I want to make sure that we got the final thought here. You had been involved in a lot in periodic review. Did you actually end up, before we go back to the policy questions, just make sure that we have here your own career. You weren't actually implementing periodic review in any of those phases, or were you? And I know at some point you transitioned to the coastal program.
Yeah, I was involved in periodic review during the phase where it was a findings effort. I think actually Jim Knight was also involved in that effort. I remember working with Jerry Offer on trying to develop sort of here are some sample sets of findings. We were able to give them out to local governments. Here's sort of what a proposed periodic review order and final order would look like and the like. So I was involved somewhat in that, but my career sort of took a turn in the mid-90s. Like I say, Greg Wolf was our deputy director at the time, and Greg had a passion for dispute resolution. And he really encouraged me to sort of move along that path. He really wanted me to be more involved in the agency's effort at mediation and dispute resolution, and just how that could integrate into both the planning system, but into other agencies as well in whatever their missions were. So I worked with a lot of natural resource agencies during that time period. I managed a grant program. I eventually took a lot of classes. I became trained. I joined
in dispute resolution.
In dispute resolution. So I sort of had a period of time where I moved into that realm, and I was doing a fair amount of that kind of what was called the Public Policy Dispute Resolution Program Manager. I worked jointly with the Dispute Resolution Commission, and I did that work up until 2003, primarily administering grants and convening cases. I did a fair amount of sort of case prep. I did some mediations on my own, but primarily our model was hiring private sector mediators in land use and other environmental disputes, and then also engaging other agencies in developing more comprehensive programs around their agency missions. So I did a fair amount of that work until I think 2003. I'm trying to remember exactly when. The legislature eventually eliminated the Dispute Resolution Commission, where I was working for them. They moved that program up to Portland State University. And then at that point, I moved back doing coastal program work. At first, I was doing a fair amount of federal consistency review work, but eventually my career ended with me being the senior coastal program policy analyst. So I did a lot of different things in the agency, from plan review team to supervisory roles to senior policy analyst, rule writing, plan review, coastal program management.
Yeah,
just
that's quite a diversity.
A lot of different things, and it was all challenging and rewarding. And I'm proud to have been a part of an agency with just incredible talent and people. I think that's the thing that gets lost over time, is just who those people were and what they did. I really believe just sort of being a part of that culture and working with the talent that was at the agency over time, and the leadership.
And of course,
the
it was
commission. Incredible commissioners over time.
It was a very long time of controversy. And so you were doing that work in the midst of what, there was another ballot initiative, was it around 1980 or 81?
Right.
And so you played a major role during, and of course the Goal 5 rulemaking must have been immensely controversial.
Yeah,
We were asked today to try and focus on Goal 10, at the housing goal, but of course, as Jim started us off on it, that is so interrelated with Goal 14, the urban growth boundary goal,
right.
and some others as well, Goal 2 and certainly, and so I wanted to make sure we turn to some of those policy questions, some of which go way back in history. If you were here in what did you say, 78?
1978, yes.
I'm sure there was a lot of history that, even though that was after the goals, or were you involved at all in Goal 10 itself?
I was not involved in the Goal 10 adoption. I was still in school at the time, so my first involvement with Goal 10 was really at the local planning efforts, at the local planning level in the city of Newburgh.
Yeah.
Trying to look at their plan and sort of bring it up to date, and work with the agency, with DLCD, to try and make sure that what we were doing locally sort of brought the plan forward and up to date with the state's housing requirements.
Well, and that gets us to the question here that we focused on in the handout that we sent you earlier, which is, can you tell us some of the issues that arose at local government and regional governments as they try to incorporate the housing goal into their comprehensive plan, and as state agencies worked to coordinate their housing-related programs with local and regional plans?
Sure, that's a big set of issues. I'll try and do my best. I think, first of all, the framework of the Goal 10 discussions involved lots of different interests. There was the Oregon Business Planning Council involved in reviews. 1,000 Friends of Oregon was a strong advocate for making sure that plans had strong urban elements, including public facilities and housing. There were the manufactured housing industry had a lobbyist that was engaged in making sure that manufactured housing, mobile homes, and sort of standalone manufactured housing that had sort of made a transition from the trailer image that had previously existed for that housing type. So they had strong advocates. The state housing...
That was Don Miner, wasn't it?
Don Miner, yes. Yeah. He was a strong advocate for those folks. I remember the State Housing Council was very active in the plan review process. Bob Clay, and I think eventually when he left, Mary Hawley was their principal staff person. Betty Niven, I think from the State Housing Council, who lived down in Eugene, she was a strong advocate as plans came in front of the commission to make sure that local plans had strong housing elements that encouraged a diversity of housing types, that made sure that people were more forward-looking than they had been, sort of more backward-looking. And I think in my experience, what I found both at the local level and at DLCD is housing planning is complicated by a lack of, or at that time, a lack of sort of both projection methodologies that worked when you're looking 20 years into the future at a set of issues that are around income levels. You're looking at housing types. You're looking at how you match sort of the housing needs of a local plan that is actually over 20 years going to dramatically change. And I think if we look backwards now, there are things we could not have anticipated that would have been nice. And about all DLCD and others could do at the time is sort of add flexibility to housing elements, make sure that at the time, back in the 70s, there was, just when I came to work for the agency, there was a really controversial policy called initially the St. Helens policy, which came out of a review of a local planning effort that actually was using sort of subjective criteria to review housing issues that gave local governments the ability on a subjective level to say no to housing that was fairly controversial in the communities. So a lot of things happening around the 70s, the late 70s, pertaining to this sort of clear and objective standards requirement that eventually became a statute and was integrated in both of LCDC's housing rules, the Goal 7 rule that applied statewide outside of Metro, and then the Goal 8, the Division 8 rule. I'm sorry, I said Goal 7, I think, but Division 7 and Division 8 were
the housing rules.
Were the housing rules that applied both statewide and in Metro. Those integrated this St. Helens policy, or a requirement that any needed housing be subject to clear and objective standards, and that conditions and requirements not be used to either delay or increase housing costs in such a way that it prevented needed housing from being provided in jurisdictions. And that was very controversial locally. If you think back to some of the early court decisions that were sort of paralleling the state land use program, one of them famously Baker versus the city of Milwaukee, that was used as part of also the Goal 2 land use planning goal consistency requirement. The notion that zoning and planning ought to match up somewhat. In Baker, there was a zone change granted that eventually, through the court process, was determined not to be acceptable because the comprehensive plan was not changed along with the zoning. And there was a so-called Baker conflict in the Milwaukee plan, where the change to multifamily housing in an area that the comprehensive plan had designated for lower density single-family use, that was unacceptable. So there's some irony here in that the Baker situation is sort of endemic of how difficult it was for some local governments to be approving changes to zoning when the community may not like multifamily housing. They may not like more density. They may not like manufactured homes. So I think the push and pull for local governments oftentimes was maintaining local autonomy over land use decision making, where there's a lot of pressure put on local decision makers to maintain communities as sort of single family, or as protecting single family areas from what was perceived as sort of the negative impacts of multifamily or higher density housing. So I think some of the controversy over the years was around how difficult it is at the local level to actually make changes that integrate more diverse types of housing into the local planning effort. And I think you see that continuing today.
Even today, we've
Even
got
today.
Corvallis right now in the spotlight over the St. You and I would translate as the St. Helens policy and an enforcement order, and some legislation on the topic. It's still highly controversial. It hasn't changed.
That's true. And another example, if you think of the city of Happy Valley, one of 27 jurisdictions inside the metro urban growth boundary, Happy Valley incorporated essentially about the same time as the goals were adopted, if I recall. And they were a defensive incorporation. They really wanted to maintain their sort of single-family, low-density enclave. They were concerned as they saw the metro region sort of moving out. They wanted to make sure they could protect their area. Eventually, I was involved in an enforcement order in the city of Happy Valley around their resistance to meeting what were the density standards in the metro housing rule, the so-called 6, 8, and 10 unit per acre standards. Although Happy Valley was a 6 unit per acre city, they really wanted to maintain low density housing. One developer had retained an attorney over many, many years to try and increase the density for their particular parcel. And over the years, eventually, Happy Valley's resistance became the subject of this enforcement order.
And was that at the acknowledgement phase? Or
Yes.
subsequent? That was one of the larger acknowledgement battles.
Yes.
On Goal 10.
Right. So I talked a little while ago about the difficulty of projections. I wanted to mention that a lot of housing planning that had been done under the HUD Section 701 plans that funded a lot of planning efforts before the goals, a lot of those efforts, local government looked sort of backwards at, well, what's our housing mix? Is it 75% single family, 25% multifamily, or even worse, 90-10 or whatever? And local governments tended to want to look backwards at those ratios, and then they would project those as their housing balance over time. And so one of the difficult issues was that there really wasn't a lot of technology in projections, as I was saying, but sort of getting beyond the backwards looking, projecting existing trends, or even taking short-term trends and projecting those. It was very difficult at the state level to try and get the foundation for housing planning, these projections, to really look more creatively at at what's your balance going to be in the future. I even think today some of the homeless issues that cities and counties are dealing with, technically that's a goal 10 issue. There's a housing need, it's not being met. Housing planning cannot really project, did we have a homeless population that needed to be accommodated within comprehensive plans? Not too dissimilar to higher density multifamily housing. For metro jurisdictions in the Portland area, that was pretty much solved by the metro housing rule with a 50-50 split that was actually set in the rule, and then the densities, like I said, the 6, 8, 10 standards.
So that probably gets to the next question a little bit, Dale. I mean, how did we do? Do you think goal 10, you just talked about a couple of the big issues with the housing goal. Did the acknowledged plans that derived from that era and that discussion, do you believe that they encourage adequate numbers of housing and rent levels and price ranges commensurate with their capabilities of those communities, and some of the other big picture requirements or goals of goal 10? Did we get there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think so. I don't think that we brought local government along far enough. I don't think, and I don't want to say not all, some local governments were very progressive when it comes to their housing planning. I like to look at this issue and other issues around the planning program in context. Prior to the state land use planning program, there was not a great understanding, I think, of all the efforts that could be done in the planning realm or the land use planning realm to actually do urban growth management, to do housing, to integrate urban growth boundaries with public facilities planning, to make sure transportation facilities meshed with what was going on in terms of housing or economic development. But I think the initial success of the planning program was creating a baseline for every local government to at least look at these issues and to maybe look at them in a more comprehensive way than they had before, to actually provide a foundational framework that starts with inventories and then looks at policy choices and then make sure those policy choices are implemented. I think if there's a success around Goal 10, it's really making sure that people paid attention to housing. People actually looked at housing mix, that they looked at making sure that a number of impediments to providing housing were removed or at least minimized. I think those are huge successes, and I think local government deserves a lot of credit for bringing its level of housing planning up to a standard that didn't exist previously, and to looking at sets of issues that they had not previously looked at in at least as comprehensive a fashion as they did under the state's planning program. So I do think there was a lot of success, there was a lot of movement, but I think housing is one of those issues that periodic review is the place where local government really needs to relook at those issues of mixed density, cost. If you think about it, the housing industry also has other impediments. The loan structure that existed prior to the planning program was actually an impediment for some communities in providing more dense or multifamily housing. You see that play itself out in other parts of the country more so than I think Oregon. So if you look at Oregon, the Oregon planning program, and you see sort of local land use regulations improved, becoming more favorable to a variety of types and densities, and you start looking at what happened in Portland in terms of condo development, and you see sort of gradually over time some of the myths and fears that people had about impacts of different housing types I think over time some of those myths get busted, and local government has a chance to move forward. That gets at,
I think that gets at a lot of it. I mean, I think the follow-up question is, of course, that today we're perceived as having, and I think correctly, a housing crisis. And it's big news. It has been for quite some time now. And there's high-level committees working all the time trying to come up with new solutions or to make what we have already work better. And I'll just mention that as something you might want to comment on. Or
Yeah, I think when you think about the planning program, and you go back and you read the statute as it initially was envisioned, it called for comprehensive planning. And what's happened in the state planning program is it's gradually evolved to being a focus on land use planning. So integrating social issues like housing, looking at actually, if you look at the language of the state housing goal, it talks about meeting the needs for housing of all citizens. Essentially, if you look at it, Goal 10 is a sort of housing rights goal that everyone, regardless of income level in a community, has a right or deserves to be accommodated in terms of housing. Well, if you think about the economy of areas, economically it may not be possible to accommodate the needs of the citizens of every city and county in the state through housing planning, because essentially there's a social element to some housing issues that may not be overcome. Or if you look at resort communities or some areas along the coast that where I worked in the coastal program at the latter part of my career, it's very difficult to find housing in resort communities that meets the needs of the workers that are employed in the resort industry, because those end up being lower paying jobs, and the price structure of land in some of these resort communities, it reaches the point where it's nearly impossible to provide housing. If you look at the private sector, his willingness to build housing for the service industry in some of these communities.
Well,
so
and
there
of
have
course,
to be more creative solutions.
Sun River is maybe the poster child of a resort community, but a lot of the coastal communities share a lot of those same attributes.
That's true.
And I know you worked a long time with those coastal communities, and the same issue you're describing occurs in cities on the coast.
Didn't we make or draw TAC papers up before we had rules? Guidance?
The agency
we
had
had a
developed a
variety.
number of policy papers, you're right. And those policy papers ranged everything from the natural resource goals
Right.
through a lot of the urban goals. I mean, St. Helens was the St. Helens policy. It was a
In the late
policy
70s you're
paper.
talking about, or
Paper.
early 80s?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we did a lot of policy papers, but I'd say probably starting in '79, there were both some court decisions around administrative law, and then eventually the legislature sort of picked up that theme and said, look, LCDC is an administrative commission, they're an administrative agency. They make decisions that essentially are bounded under what's called the Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA as the Department of Justice calls it, that's outlined in ORS Chapter 183. And so out of that came this notion that these policy papers really needed to be administrative rules.
Formally adopted.
Formally adopted by the Commission through a rulemaking process that involved public input, and then filing of those rules eventually once they're adopted with the Secretary of State's office, so that everyone sort of knew what the playing field was.
Including the agency.
Including the agency. So the policy papers beginning in the late 70s, early 1980s, were gradually converted to
Rules.
administrative rules. So you see a lot of the rules developed over time in response to both legislative pressure and the notion that as an administrative agency under administrative procedures, we really need to do that.
And the
So-
Metro Housing Rule was one of the first examples of that, is it?
That was.
I know it was done before I came on, but I think you saw all that development, and
And I was involved in both the Metro and statewide housing rules, although really the leadership for those efforts came from Greg Winterroud. He had an incredible background in Goal 10, in housing. He understood those issues. He had done a fair amount of housing planning work, sort of beyond what I had done at the local level. And sort of brought, I think, a lot more experience than I had with those. In fact, Goal 10 was really his expertise, and he was lead for Goal 10. And although I was involved in that as part of the urban team, Greg really took the lead.
yeah, and I think there'll be an interview, or has already perhaps been one, with Greg. But can you describe some of the issues? I know that the Metro area always provides issues that are not necessarily reflected anywhere else in the state, but that are certainly no less controversial and perhaps even more so. So what were some of the housing issues that derive from that Metro experience, Goal 10 issues?
The Metro housing rule, if you go back one step to the urban growth boundary, is really where it started. Prior to Metro's existence, there was CRAG and the Columbia Region Area Association of Governments, if I recall, trying to remember the acronym, but they developed sort of a baseline urban growth boundary for the 27 jurisdictions that were inside the Metro urban growth boundary. And as that urban growth boundary was being developed and the plan review process was starting, the agency, DLCD, was working with CRAG, then Metro, became Metro, on a review of that urban growth boundary. So if you think of the Metro housing rule as having a foundation in the assumptions that went into the urban growth boundary, the need for economic development land, the need for housing, the assumptions about housing mix, housing density. So the foundations for the Metro housing rule really came out of Metro's efforts at doing housing planning on a regional basis.
And their own assumptions and projections.
And their own assumptions and projections. I know Greg worked hand in hand, not only with the local governments that were involved within the Metro region, but with Metro itself, to sort of craft a set of requirements that overall would not undermine the efficacy of this regional urban growth boundary. The whole notion of making sure that the boundary doesn't get busted by housing planning or economic development planning that essentially results in sprawl and a need to expand the boundary prematurely. And I think we've seen that play out over time, that both the Metro urban growth boundary and the Metro housing rule and the way economic development happened in various regions, particularly I think if you look at Washington County, some of the early projections for both housing and economic development there seemed a little bit out of line, but they have come to fruition over time. So, you know, all of those efforts really sort of melded together to result in the Metro housing rule.
I think that's good. Where we ultimately want to go with the question, I suppose, is whether you have some thoughts on the future, you know, whether you have some ideas that you think should shape the future of the program. But I didn't want to ignore other goals that you have been so involved in. And if you think we're getting on to about an hour now. We can go over if we need be, but I know that you have a lot of other experience with the department, and we probably haven't been able to touch on that yet. Are there some things that you wanted to talk about in terms of the history that are real important for the audiences of these oral history projects, that we left some things off today?
I'm curious also about how much contact you have with local planners. You know, they might think we have somebody in the inside, quote unquote, who maybe knows a lot more about this and can give us some feedback. And did you have those kind of communications either informally, or I thought we had a planning group too that worked with us?
Well, over the years, I worked with lots of planners and
Right.
was heavily involved the middle part of my career in APA and was AICP.
Right.
And so I had a lot of connections with the planning community. Early on, more city planners, and then I think later on, as I did more natural resource issues and a lot of processes, more county planners. We always were involved with the City Planning Directors Association and the County Association of Oregon County Planning Directors. We convened advisory committees around almost all of our rulemaking efforts, unless it was like a minor amendment or a change to the rule that was mandated by, say, a statute or a court case. But, you know, in answer to your question, yes, we involved a lot of local planners in our efforts. Like I said, my initial reason for coming to the department was my hope to bring sort of the expertise of a local planner, having dealt with planning issues at that level, to the agency. And I think over time there have been a number of local planners that have come on board with the same motivations. But I want to get to Bob's question if I can. I do want to talk overview a little bit. You know, when I look at the state planning program, I think of it in terms of its successes around sort of clusters of goals or issues. I think if you think about process goals, goals 1 and goal 2, citizen involvement, that was a pretty important aspect of the program early on. I think LCDC's efforts at goal adoption involved citizens in a fairly broad way that has never been repeated. And I think one of the things that I would hope for the future is that there could be an effort statewide at having the commission engage its broader citizenry in sort of looking at where we are and whether or not there are opportunities in the future. I don't think the connection that the state population had to the land use program at the beginning has ever been duplicated, and I think over time we've seen gradually the number of people that are part of the state program are more issue focused and less broadly focused on the program. So that's one set of issues, goal 1, goal 2. The rural part of the program has been an incredible success. And by that I mean the agricultural lands goal, the forest land goal, the natural resource goal. Those series of goals, along with drawing urban growth boundaries, have been the things that as you drive Interstate 5 from south to north in the state, you really see a difference here than you see in a number of other places. That has really been a dramatic change in the state, I think, from the pressure that existed in the early 1970s towards development. And if you think about the impetus for the state land use program, there was concern about Charbonneau, Wilsonville as some of the initial enclaves into what could happen in the state without some sort of farm and forest protection program.
Urban sprawl from Portland extending.
Or from Salem out, or from Eugene or Medford. And you just see, you can kind of see the results. In fact, there's one anecdote. There was one short-term director that didn't have a lot of experience in Oregon that was here I don't remember the years,
Paul?
but sort of an anecdote of him driving up and down the valley with our farmland expert and musing about all this incredible developable land that someone should take advantage of. But indeed, that developable land is in agricultural use and really promotes the state's agricultural industry, which is a huge economic driver. So when you think about the rural goals or the rural components, those have really preserved economic drivers of the community. Forest lands protection, and so I think those are important to mention and to recognize the efforts in that area. Pretty creative use of exclusive farm use zoning as a primary vehicle to both protecting farmland and maintaining through Goal 3 agricultural areas in large enough blocks that they can continue to be productive without either encroachment or interference from rural development patterns that were creating concern for the early founders of the program. I also think it's worth mentioning the coastal program and the coastal goals. Oregon was the second state in the country behind Washington to have its coastal program approved at the federal level. And when you look or drive along the coast, again, you see the benefits of having a great coastal management program, estuaries, coastal shorelands. You see even ocean resources planning out to the state's 3-mile limit. Some of those issues that are now administered by state lands. Essentially, they're the steward of the state's ownership into the area governed by what's called Goal 19, ocean resources. So I think it's important to recognize the impact of sort of the urban clusters of goals, the rural natural resource goals, and the coastal goals as protecting a variety of resources. In retrospect, that was pretty thoughtful. I also want to note that over the years, LCDC itself, the commission, has played an incredible role. There have been great leaders on the commission over time. I don't want to recount all of their names, but it's just, and I'm hoping that some of them can be interviewed. We've lost a number of them to age, but they have provided a lot of leadership, as has the department. The department went from this beginning cluster of incredible energy and talent to trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean, to, okay, now we kind of know what it means, to how do we implement that on a statewide level, and then on into periodic review. I think on the big picture issues, it's also worth noting that there were some parallel legal developments over time. The land use program itself is in statute, but we have a legal framework that goes back to some court cases like Fasano versus Washington County, Baker versus Milwaukee, Green versus Hayward. Some of those initial forays of the courts that were in parallel to what the land use program did, and then the eventual...
Primarily the Oregon courts.
The Oregon courts I'm speaking of. And then the advent of the Land Use Board of Appeals as an appellate agency with specialists that can actually look at land use issues. Those were pieces of the land use program that I think are often forgotten. And I think particularly when you look at early on, you had the commission reviewing goal issues. That set of responsibilities was eventually passed on in the post-acknowledgement period to the Land Use Board of Appeals. So I think it's important to recognize all of those things come together. It's not just the goals or just the agency or just the commission. it's the planning community in general and a very comprehensive framework.
And the thing I'm concerned about, and both of you guys are longer term than I was, I left in '03, but it's outreach to the communities out there that have either old, and I'm talking about successive elections of county commissioners and city councils and so forth, as well as, are we all right? And I'm just curious to talk about outreach here in terms of what can the agency do, and this is more of a future-oriented thought, but what are we doing about outreach now? And I don't expect you to have explicit answers, but is that a concern? I have a concern about that if we go to certain places, they don't even know much about what's happened in the past. And we're not trying to take tests and so forth, but we need to go to people and interact with them and help them understand what we have invested as a state, what's going on now 4 decades. Hard to believe what is 40 years. And where are we going in the future? I mean, these are big issues, big questions, and I'm just curious as we talk to people like yourself who are very, very seasoned veterans, both of you, but not just Bob, but you know what I'm trying to say is that where are we going with getting the word out? Or is that not an issue?
Oh, Jim, I think it's an incredible issue. I mean, that's why I was saying that at the beginning of the program, there was a huge outreach effort.
Yeah.
The developing of the goals, there was a community around those. I think some of that being in touch with how we got here, what the goals mean, what the comprehensive plans mean, just how does a small or medium-sized city in central or eastern Oregon have a connection to the program? I once had a mayor ask me for a copy of his comprehensive plan because he couldn't find one at City Hall, and so it is important that citizens, leaders, mayors, councilors, county commissioners, that LCDC and all of their stakeholders be able to sort of have a connection to why it is things are the way they are, and then maybe even looking at, is what we have good enough? Is it still the right approach, the right sets of standards? We probably each have our own answer to that, but where do we go? And you don't answer the where do we go question until you reach out and educate a variety of stakeholders into where we are and how we got here. So that outreach, I think, is critical and important.
It is critical, and I'd like to bring more people on board about that to help us, you know, construct, quote unquote, an outreach effort that touches on a number of these points that you're making now. Keith Kubik, for example, in Douglas County, I'm not even sure, is he retired yet or not, but or is he going to live forever? But, you know, he's been through the wars, quote unquote, but I think people like him, what's his name in Union County, who's on our commission?
Is Hanley Jenkins? Well,
And
even Matt Spangler, who's on our staff, was a county planning director from long ago.
There's, you know, what's his name in Coos County? He's not there anymore.
Oh, Bill Gryle.
But, and a sharp, almost unfriendly critic, but he can bring some thoughts to outreach too. So.
And of course there are dozens and dozens of very interesting players at the local level. I want to bring this to an end, Dale, and make sure that there's been a chance to say everything that you wanted to. Probably not, but you know, is there any sort of concluding remarks you might have, or?
Well, I think this is a very complex area. Planning, land use planning, the broader planning framework that existed in the initial statutes. So it's really difficult to capture that in one or even a series of interviews. I think the important thing in the land use program is that we brought an effort together that created a framework for planning in the state that didn't exist before. There's sort of a level baseline playing field that regardless of what community you go to in the state, there is a plan. There is a zoning ordinance, a set of land use regulations and requirements, and citizens and the state population is supported by that framework. Whether they know it exists or not, it's there for everyone and to support everyone. And I think my only closing comment is credit goes to the founders and the leaders that created this, moved it forward, and at each level from now and into the future have a hand in making sure that the program and that framework is the best it can be at any point in time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.